All right, so this week we're going to talk about sensory evaluation in the food lab. Okay, so let's start our slides here, and the slides are available for you as well. So, sensory evaluation. We've talked previously about objective evaluation, so measuring stuff that isn't biased by the human as much as possible. So, sensory evaluation is a little bit different. So, the importance of sensory evaluation really impacts the following questions: how we evaluate our food, or how do you evaluate the food that you eat? What role does sensory evaluation play in how we purchase and consume our foods? And then, what role does sensory evaluation play in food production? So, there are a lot of careful and very thorough tests to help food companies and food manufacturers develop formulations or processing techniques. What foods or products are going to be successful in the marketplace. A lot of this is based on sensory evaluation and trained sensory panels. So, trained sensory panelists evaluate samples and provide guidance for product improvement, research and development, and things like that before a food even gets to the marketplace. So these are pictures of my son Jesse, who's now 6 years old. Some of you have met him. And kids, when they're tasting foods for the first time, when we first introduce foods to children at about 4 months, so again, depending on their reflexes and things, if they can sit up, if they have the proper swallowing reflexes and things like that, we start to introduce foods at 4 months old. All right, so you can probably tell which is his younger ages and things like this. But kids taste flavors and they express their sensory preferences, and their sensory eval is through their facial expressions, okay? But also, kids, they're not only tasting with their mouth, they're tasting and feeling everything with their hands as well. All right, so you could think about your parents probably have your first taste of a lemon, your first taste of an Oreo. So this is Jesse's first Oreo. This is his first bite of an apple because he had gotten teeth. A lot of these pictures, Jesse doesn't have teeth. This was his 1 year old birthday party. He'd never had cake. This was a lemon picture, as you could see. But the way that they explore food is not only with their mouth, right? It's with their hands, their eyes, their nose, everything. If you've ever fed a baby or you babysit, you know that they get food all over. So sensory evaluation is a subjective evaluation, meaning we're relying on a human to do this. So it's evaluation by individuals using scorecards. We try to make those scorecards as objective as possible, but essentially people are judging with their senses. So sight, smell, taste, and sometimes touch. So a baby touch is definitely involved, but with adults, depending on the food, not as much. So this is kind of how we divide sensory testing, and I have a lot of examples to show you in the lab part this week for our sensory lab. But we have analytical tests. So these tests are used to detect differences between samples, and then affective tests, which are used to detect individual preferences. So affect meaning mood or individual feelings, and analytical, we're trying to get people to discriminate between differences in products. So this being the more objective of the two sensory testing, okay? And then, of course, we could break these down into different types of tests. So the analytical test can be, again, discriminative or descriptive. So when we ask somebody to describe something, again, how sweet is something, how salty is something, that kind of thing. Everybody has their own way to describe these things, but we try to quantify differences based on using different types of tools that are objective in nature and that we can quantify later and analyze for our studies. Okay. And again, discriminative tests, meaning can people detect differences between two types of samples? Are the samples different? So again, we're going to go over some difference tests in the lab this week. And then sensitivity tests. So how sensitive is somebody's palate to a flavor change, or what is the detection of threshold or the dilution of threshold? All right. The main studies that most students in the class would be using would be the difference test, but we have had students in this class for their project do some threshold testing. All right, but these ones would be the main ones that folks have used. Now for the individual preferences, most of these would be how much do you like this? So that's a hedonic scale. Hedonic meaning liking or pleasure. So rating it on a scale of 1 to 5 or 0 to 100 or smiley to frowny face, depending on your audience. Okay. And again, we'll go over more of these in the lab portion of the course this week. So we're first going to start out with our sense of sight. And you've all probably heard, we eat with our eyes first. So again, this is the first cues that we receive about food. So this is the shape, what it looks like, what it may feel like. So that visual texture to the food, and of course the color. So all of these messages are received via our eyes. So think of it if you're blindfolded. All right, if you're asked to taste something blindfolded, if you're a panelist, or if you're a non-sighted person, how different your experience with food is if you can't see it. Okay, so without seeing the color, without seeing the texture, the shape, and that kind of thing, think how that changes your experience. So again, I think all of us have had that experience where somebody serves us something that upon first look doesn't seem very attractive. And does that change your perception of how that food will smell or taste before it even gets close to your face? So again, I think it is true that we eat with our eyes first. But, if you're a non-sighted person or if you were blindfolded and somebody put something in front of you and it smelled really good and you didn't see how awful it may have looked, that would really change how you evaluated that product or food. So we judge by our sight, or we ask panelists to judge by sight using a few different methods. There's a few subcategories to do this. So appearance, what do things look like? How many ways can we describe what something looks like, talking about food or drinks? So color is probably the most critical, depending on what characteristic you're looking at. So if you're thinking about, a baked good, what is the gold standard color for a pound cake? So we have an exterior color we could be asking about, an interior color we could be asking about. All right. So you have to think, what is the most desirable? What is the gold standard? So that's why I'm saying to you guys for your research project, sorry, my earbud is popping out. That's why I'm saying you need to have the one control recipe. So your gold standard, something you know really well, that people like, and then your one alteration. Okay. But we evaluate color to determine desirability or acceptability in human terms, of course. And color oftentimes, and you can think of your own experiences, color often triggers our mind to expect a particular flavor. So if I gave you something, especially something that you perceived to be fruity that was blue, you would probably expect something like blueberry or blackberry or raspberry, that flavor to come. If I said to you, this is raspberry ice cream, and it was green, would you expect it to taste like raspberry? Would that change your taste of it if it did taste like raspberry? So those are really interesting things that we can trick people's mind with those types of things. And I'm sure you all have an experience that you can recall where you tasted something that didn't taste at all what it was supposed to based on its color or its description. And I encourage you to share in the general forum for everybody to hear about that. But color can also be objective. So we can measure color in wavelength. So there are special color lenses that can actually say, this is the color that it is. So kind of like that paint color capture thing in Lowe's where you can take a picture of something and say, I want this paint color to match. It's very similar to that. So there are lab tools to determine color. And there are also scales to match color. So people can say, instead of, if I say something's blue and somebody else says it's purple, there are exact matching color palettes that you can use for your research subjects. Now, things that might influence the color of a food on the food end or culinary end, of course, would be how ripe the food is, how much it's been processed or cooked, the pH, and these are things you're going to learn throughout the class. So this will obviously help you to develop your study as well. Enzymatic browning, of course, and anything added to the food like natural or artificial colorings like food dye or fruit juice and things like that. So you have to think about what this means for your evaluation methods. So again, the colors of food really impact what people think this may taste like, or of course what they expect based on their knowledge of what the food may be. Another way to examine or describe appearance is surface characteristics. So I mentioned the surface of a pound cake versus the interior of a pound cake. So the exterior of a pound cake, the crust, usually should be a nice golden brown, versus the interior of a pound cake would be a nice golden yellow. Okay, so the surface characteristics of food products contribute to their appearance. So what do people find desirable about that surface characteristic? So for a piece of fruit, for instance, a wrinkled peach might not be as desirable as a smooth peach. Scrambled eggs that appear dry might be less desirable than those that are glistening and glossy. Okay, and I'm trying to think of examples from products that students have made. So brownies. So what is the quintessential brownie? What does that surface characteristic look like? So again, some people like an end piece, some people don't. So you really have to choose from the middle of the brownie pan. So what should the middle of a brownie look like? What does that perfect brownie texture look like on the surface? Now, volume, how high something rises, that's also a characteristic of appearance. So something that is or should be risen high, like an angel food cake, if it appears very compact and dense, that is less desirable in its appearance. All right. And then, of course, our interior qualities of a product also have to be considered. So again, the interior of a brownie, the interior of an angel food cake or pound cake, gravy. So lumpy gravy or mashed potatoes may be perceived as less desirable as well. Oops. There we go. Okay, so on to smell. So how do we ask people to tell us about smell or odor? But odor is the majority of how we taste our food. Okay, so odor is very important, and the word odor might have a negative connotation. So I'll use the word aroma. So how we smell our food is very important. So our sense of smell is very strong, and are important not only preliminary cues to the acceptability of a food. So we smell something and then we may want to eat it or not eat it, but also it's important to taste when food is in the mouth as well. So again, to define odor or aroma, it's the volatile chemical compounds that interact with the millions of olfactory receptors in our nose. So again, this is something that we smell before we have a food in our mouth. And of course, I think we all have smelled something and have said, no, thank you, before we want to eat it. And somebody says, well, you should taste this. It's really good if you can get over the smell. I had that experience with, I think it was a Thai snack. So this Thai snack was like a salty, savory cracker, like a buttered caramel cracker, but it also had dried shrimp and codfish and other types of things. So it smelled like dried fish. It smelled like fish food. But if I got over the smell, it actually tasted really good. So a lot of interesting Asian snacks out there that have very strong odors, but if you could get over that hump of the odor, you're okay. Now, once something is in your mouth, we have additional olfactory receptors that contribute further information. So more volatile compounds are brought in contact with our oral receptors in our mouth by not only sniffing the food when we eat, by swallowing the food, mixing with our saliva and things like that, and deliberately exhaling sharply after swallowing the food. That's how we can determine aftertaste. So if you've ever watched a trained sensory panelist, They're huffing a lot when they eat. If you've watched somebody who's very serious about tasting wine, it's a lot of sniffing, huffing, noises, things like that. And that helps somebody really taste something, to taste all the different notes. I would imagine most of us don't eat our food around the dinner table like that. But if you're a trained taste panelist, these are some of the techniques that are used to basically taste any off compounds. And this is because in humans, our sense of smell is much more acute than our sense of taste, and in most animals as well, to try to sniff out danger before things get into our body and poison us. And also, this is because our sense of smell is so strong and acute. People recall smells with about 65% of accuracy after a year, while the visual recall of photos is, only about 50% after only 3 months. So we can remember smells for a really long period of time versus remembering people's faces after a very short period of time. So I'm sure you all have a memory of something from when you were very little, and it's likely a smell. So one smell I always remembered was my grandmother's. It's not aftershave, but like a bath splash thing, and they don't even sell this stuff anymore. But I remember the smell, and I associate that smell with her. If I ever smell anything remotely close to it, I remember what the bottle looks like because of that smell. And humans can distinguish between about 10,000 different smells. And for other animals, it's much greater because their sense of smell has to be much greater in the wild. So adaptation, olfactory adaptation. This is a decreased response despite continuous stimulus. So what does this mean for our evaluation methods in the lab or when we're doing a study? So I'm going to give you a hint. Competing aromas. So do we serve, different things that smell different at the same time? Bad idea. So if you have, condition A or the control condition, and it has its odor and it has to be evaluated, you don't also have condition B in the same area for them to be mixing, especially if you're having somebody evaluate aroma. All right, because our noses become quickly saturated with odors. So if you're asking somebody to really evaluate a food sample and you don't want them to essentially become contaminated with the second sample, you really need to separate those samples. And another impact of this as well is people wearing being heavily scented themselves. So sensory panelists are asked to come into the lab without heavy perfumes, without heavy deodorants, without anything that's going to interfere with them smelling and tasting the foods and basically measuring the characteristics that you want them to measure. And of course, in food service as well, when you're a dietitian, you'll likely be asked as part of the dress code not to wear anything that is very strong, because that does affect people's sense of taste and smell as well. So most hospitals, as part of their dress code, do have those types of rules. So, still talking about aroma or odor. So acceptability of aroma is very important to overall acceptability of food. So something, again, that smells good is enticing, and something that smells not so good, we tend to avoid. And again, we as humans evolved to avoid bad smells because we probably associated bad smells with something that could kill us or poison us. And this is especially true if food is served warm or hot, because the volatility of those compounds increases. It's related to temperature. So again, think about what this means for your evaluation methods. All right. If a food is supposed to be consumed warm and you want people to evaluate certain characteristics of that food, you need to serve it at the temperature at which it's supposed to be evaluated. All right. So I'm thinking soups and stews and things like that. You can't let it sit and be room temperature for people to evaluate it if it's supposed to be served warm, because it will taste different if it's a different temperature for everybody, and that will be a confounding factor. All right. Conversely, baked goods and everything, while they smell so good coming out of the oven, how hard would that be unless all of your panelists were sitting right there when everything came out of the oven? how hard would it be for everybody to be ensured that a piece of bread or a cookie or a cake or whatever you're serving is the exact same temperature? So that's why baked goods, because literally most of us buy them right at the store when they're room temperature, should be served at room temperature. So we really want to ensure that all panelists get everything the same exact way, and temperature is especially important. All right, so now on to the sense of taste, which is also called gustation. So our taste buds, everybody has heard and probably seen your own taste buds, are tight clusters of taste and other supportive cells that encircle a pore on your tongue. And if we were in the classroom, I'd have you each stick out your tongues at each other. And everybody's taste buds and everybody's tongue look a little bit different. And they're usually in the upper surface of the tongue. But this is the primary way that adults perceive taste. Now, children have additional taste buds in their cheeks as well as their hard and soft palates, but these kind of die off and lose functionality as they grow older. But the reason for children having those additional taste buds is the way that children feed in their early months. So they don't chew and swallow the way we do. They don't eat with their tongue like a cat, right? So they breastfeed or they bottle feed, and the sucking reflex pulls the food, so the breast milk or formula pulls the food into their cheeks and up into their hard and soft palates. And that's how babies perceive flavor. And again, these atrophy when they're not being used once they're weaned off a bottle and weaned onto food. And then their regular taste sensations develop over the first 2 years. All right. But in adults and then in children, a taste message is initiated when a substance dissolves on the tongue. So a substance has to dissolve on the tongue and come into contact with a taste cell. So people who swallow a ghost pepper whole and don't chew it and it doesn't come into contact with a taste cell, they're not tasting anything. So that's technically cheating because they're not getting that spiciness. But again, potassium ions escape the cell, they generate an electrical impulse to the brain. And if there's a ton of molecules impinging on taste cells from other issues like medications or anything like that, taste intensity can be increased or more likely decreased. But most of us have, around 10,000 or so taste buds. And again, most of them are found on the tongue. And taste buds, again, are capable of detecting five different flavors or different tastes. So, of course, we have a sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Okay. So sour would be acidity. Bitter would be ions like potassium and magnesium, quinine, caffeine. Your medicines are all very bitter. Salty is sodium, of course, and umami is that savory taste. So this is a derivative of the amino acid glutamic acid. So this is your monosodium glutamate or L-glutamate. And monosodium glutamate, as everybody knows, is a flavor potentiator or flavor enhancer. So this means that it enhances the flavor of other compounds without adding its own unique flavor, and it stimulates umami receptors. Now, astringency is another characteristic, but it's not one of the five tastes. But that's what creates the puckery sensation in your mouth. So it doesn't mean sour, but like if you taste a wine that's very dry and astringent is the word I use. So something that's an opposite of smooth. But it's caused by polyphenols such as tannins. So this could be in tea or wine or coffee. So again, it's that puckery sensation you get in your cheeks when something is the opposite of smooth. And wine is the best example I can think of right now. Now, other sensations in our mouth could be that fiery quality when we do bite into a hot pepper, and that's from capsaicin. and capsaicin and other related compounds is that fiery quality. So not spiciness, but that hot, my mouth is on fire quality. And then we have actual pain. So things that cause our mouth pain, we have neurons that sense pain in our mouth. And then glucosinolates, these are sulfur-containing irritants in mustards and horseradish. That's a different sensation than heat or spiciness, though most people describe it that way. They describe horseradish as spicy, but it's really that your mouth is being irritated, and really your nose as well. But if you just talk about flavor, what is flavor? Flavor is a sensory message that blends both the taste and smell perceptions when food is in your mouth. But taste is more smell when it's in your mouth than it is on your tongue. And you can put this into action by just holding your nose and closing your eyes and trying to tell the difference between coffee or tea. Try to, if you're 21 or older, try to detect the difference between white wine and red wine, or brandy or whiskey. All right. And beverages are a little easier to do this with just because they coat your whole tongue at the same time. With a blocked nose, if you have a cold or something like that, it's a perfect example. But you really can't tell the difference between a grated apple and a grated onion. So if you have a roommate or sibling that's sick, this is a great trick. You could say, here's some grated apple, and then grate some onion for them. If they're really sick, they won't be able to tell the difference. Now, sub-threshold levels and threshold. So threshold is the point at which we can detect a difference in something, but we have ingredients that can change sub-thresholds. So for instance, salt, it increases sweetness and decreases sourness. So think of all the salt that's included in our baked goods. So there is a reason why there's salt in our baked goods. There's a reason why salted caramel, everything tastes so good. Or dark chocolate with sea salt in it tastes so good. Okay? Because it increases the sweetness of those items. People also put salt on lemon, or think of the salt on a margarita with lime. It decreases the sourness. Now, acid, that increases saltiness. So again, your vinegar that you put on your fish and chips, same thing. Or Italians, they squeeze lemon on their fried foods. You will not have fried food anywhere in Italy or in any real Italian restaurant without a side of lemons to squeeze on. And that's because it enhances the salty flavor. You won't need to put salt on it. And then sugar reduces saltiness and bitterness. So again, people put sugar on their grapefruit to reduce the bitterness. Sugar reduces saltiness, putting it in tomato sauce and things like that. And also, what is our threshold for tasting sweet? So these are natural sweeteners, sweetener compounds. So, we're not even talking yet about the artificial sweeteners. We'll get to that when we talk about carbohydrates. But in descending order, fructose is the sweetest, how we can detect. And then lactose, the sugar in milk, is the least sweet. And, sweet thresholds, or the how sweet these sugars are, is really important to remember when substituting sugars and sugar substitutes in recipes. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of super tasters, and I have, if you click in the PDF of the slides, here is a video to take you to more information about this. But super tasters are people who have more than the normal amount of taste papillae and taste buds. And studies have shown or associated being a super taster, which is a test you can take and that we have used in the food lab that I studied in for my master's degree. They tend not to like green vegetables and fatty foods because they can taste the volatile compounds more so than people who aren't super tasters. For example, dark green leafy vegetables have more bitter compounds in them. They can taste those bitter compounds more than normal tasters, who make up 50% of the population. And in fatty foods, they can pick up volatile compounds in oils, perhaps that have gone rancid and things like that, or over fried. So they could pick up acrylamide and things like that, more so than the 50% of us who are not super tasters. So you could see super tasters who make up about 25% of the population or so. They have a very dense population of papillae on their tongue. So we mentioned that flavor is the sensory message that combines both the odor in the mouth and the taste. And this happens with your trigeminal cavity. So this is 3 body parts that are required for you to perceive flavor. So it's your taste buds, your olfactory receptors, and then your whole mouth cavity. All right, so you need saliva and all that other stuff. And, when describing flavor, this is very difficult, or can be very difficult for people to describe. So if we just take the word hot, for example, this can be used a few different ways. And so this example I provide here, I can use the word hot to say 2 different things. I can say hot to describe the temperature of a food, or hot to describe a burning sensation in my mouth, or spiciness. So those 2 things can be actually not synonymous. So sometimes when asking people to describe flavor, it's easier and more valid to ask them to rate the acceptability of the food, or how much do you like this flavor, or asking them to assess a specific flavor. For instance, rate the sweetness of this item. So a certain aspect of the flavor. So sweetness, saltiness, bitterness. So one of the 5 tastes. And then, of course, the serving temperature of a food greatly influences the flavor, as we mentioned. So again, coffee. So coffee as cold brew tastes totally different than coffee served hot off the pot. And, you can make this example for most other foods. So the best temperature for most taste evaluation is anywhere from 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, of course, depending on the food and how it should be served, or how it's expected to be served. So the presence of an aftertaste may be of a concern. So again, an aftertaste is, we usually assess or describe aftertaste as something that's unpleasant, or something that's bitter or displeasing. So what are some foods that you guys think that may have an aftertaste? And again, I use this term to mean something that's unpleasant, or something that stays in your mouth after you swallowed the food. So this is something that should really be assessed on its own as a separate entry on your scorecard. So you might want to assess this, or consider aftertaste as a sensory characteristic for your project if you're going to substitute or add an ingredient that is known to cause an unpleasant aftertaste. So examples of ingredients would be sucralose or aspartame, or something that people complain about, oh, that has an aftertaste, I don't like it. All right, so this is a very specific thing that I would ask about if you're using an ingredient that people complain about aftertaste. So the next thing that we could talk about in our mouth is texture. So texture can be visual, as we mentioned, as a surface characteristic, or it can be something that we feel in our mouth. So something like graininess, that can be described by our eye or our mouth. Chewiness, more our mouth. Astringency, that's our mouth again. That could be a texture. Again, not all descriptions are appropriate for all foods. So that's why, we're looking at all of these words if you're reading some of the materials I put up. But a lot of texture words can be by sight and by mouth, or they're mutually exclusive. So one way we can get at texture, and this is texture by mouth, is to ask somebody to count the number of chews. So the number of chews is very closely correlated to the penetrometer, which is the tool used to objectively measure texture, or how tender something is, which we looked at in the lab last week. So the number of chews, again, is subjective, in which the panelists choose a standard bite of food to the same endpoint, and then records how many actual number of chews he or she was required to reach that endpoint each time. Okay. So the point of this slide is basically to say if you're asking people to describe texture for you, you really have to be well defined. You have to well define what you're asking them to tell you. All right, so as for the scorecards and other things, we're going to do that in the lab this week and actually talk about how to set up a taste panel or a sensory panel and then the different tests you would do. But if you have any questions on the material that was just presented, post them to the general forum, the general questions forum, and I will see you soon.